Hello, everybody. In Chapter 2, we're going to be talking about understanding economics and how it affects business. So, the things we're going to cover here in this chapter is economic conditions and how it affects business, understanding free market capitalism, understanding socialism, understanding communism, the difference between the two, the trend towards mixed economics, and then understanding the U.S. economy. So, what is economics? Um, Economics is the study of how society chooses to employ resources and produce goods and services and distribute them for consumption among various competing groups and individuals. So mainly it's just kind of a study on how businesses are running within, the nation, within the world, that sort of thing. Down here we have two things: macroeconomics and microeconomics. So macro is the part of the economics the study that looks at the operation of nation's economy as a whole, and then micro is a little more concentrated, where it's the part of the economic study that looks at the behavior of people and organizations in particular markets. If you're going to continue your education with business courses and get a bachelor's in business, more than likely you're going to take a macroeconomics course and a microeconomics course. They have a lot of similarities, but like I said, with the micro, it's just a little more concentrated. You're going to, kind of dive a little bit deeper into, different things that help out with the micro part of it. So resource development, that's just the study of how to increase resources and create conditions that will make better use of those resources. So this is a really big topic right now, just because we are trying to find different ways, to produce things within the world. So some of the examples down here: new energy sources, new ways of growing foods, new ways of creating goods and services. So, going to the energy part here, if you're on 55 and you're heading north, you get around to like the Elkhart area, and you take a look over to the east, you're going to find a lot of like wind farms that are going up. Same way, if you get a little bit north of there, go around the 136 area, Emden, McLean exit, that sort of thing. They have wind farms through that area. So those are just kind of two wind farms here in central Illinois that are making a really big impact, all over the world. And it's not going to be all that surprising that we're going to start to see more of those pop up throughout the years. So the secret to creating a wealthy economy, Thomas Malthus, and the dismal science behind it. Malthus believed that if the rich had most of the wealth and the poor had the most of the population, resources would run out. This belief led the writer Thomas Carlyle to call economics the dismal science. So latest world statistics show population growing more slowly than expected. I know population is at an all-time high, but yeah, we are starting to see a little bit of a slowdown on it. So, contrary to Malthus, some macroeconomics believe that a large population can be a resource. An educated population is highly valuable, and business owners provide jobs and economic growth for their employees and communities as well as for themselves. So, kind of like what we talked about in chapter one, is having highly educated people around you and being able to contribute to society and businesses, and hopefully coming up with entrepreneurial ideas. So Adam Smith, he believed that freedom was vital to any economy's survival. Freedom to own land or property and the right to keep profits of a business is essential. People work hard if they believe they will be rewarded. So this is just kind of like the free market and kind of what the United States believes. So, applying Adam Smith's theory, business owners are motivated to work hard because they know they will earn and keep rewards. When they are prosper, they are able to grow, indirectly helping the community and the larger economy grow in the process. What might motivate you to start your own business? So, kind of like what we talked about with chapter one, where if you're an entrepreneur, you're starting out with a business. Why are you starting out with that business? I mean, is there a problem that you're having, and you see a solution to that problem? Do you just want to be kind of your own boss? Do you just want your own freedom? And if you do start your own business, you have the right to make as much money as you want to. I mean, I think that's kind of the big allure to becoming an entrepreneur and starting your own business is, it's all up to you. So you can make as much as you want, and you can make as little as you want. So I think that's what, here in the United States is really kind of cool, where everybody kind of has that entrepreneurial spirit. From a very early age, everybody kind of wants to be their own boss. Hmm. So the invisible hand theory, as people improve their own situation in life, they help the economy prosper through production of goods, services, and idea. So the invisible hand, that's just a phrase coined by Adam Smith to describe the process that turns self-directed gain into social and economic benefits for all. So if you're doing well, the economy locally is probably going to be doing pretty well. Also, so when you look around, I mean, if one business is doing well, they're probably going to kind of go over to, their supplier or their consumers, and it's going to reflect on them as well. So everybody's kind of in it together. So understand the invisible hand theory. A farmer earns money by selling his crops. To earn more, the farmer hires workers to produce more crops. When the farmer produces more, there is plenty of food for the community, and the farmer helped his employees and his community while helping himself. So this is a great example of that invisible hand. So capitalism, that's something that we have here in the United States. So it's an economic system in which all or most of the factors of production and distribution are privately owned and operated for profit. So countries with capitalist systems, like I said, the United States, England, Australia, Canada. So when you look at these countries, I would say, they're very successful countries, and we all work with one another. And yeah, we're all allies in trying to help create a free market. So state capitalism is a combination of free markets and some government control. So China has experienced rapid growth using state capitalism. So we kind of touched on this with chapter one, where they are kind of a free market, but at the same time they do have a lot of government, help and control over a lot of things. So I mean, you can go into business for your own, but if the government doesn't necessarily approve of it, I mean, it's going to be really hard to, prosper in your own business. So capitalism's four basic rights. You have the right to own private property. You have the right to own a business and keep all that business's profits. You have the right to freedom of competition and the right to freedom of choice. So all of these things apply here in the United States, and it's really easy to see, how they would apply here. So Roosevelt's four additional freedoms come with, freedom of speech and expression, freedom to worship in your own way, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And like I was saying, the free market, that's decisions about how and how much, about what and how much to produce are made by the market. Consumers send signals about what they like and how they like it. Price tells companies how much of a product they should produce, and if something is wanted but hard to get, the price will rise until more products are available. And we'll talk about like supply and demand here in a few minutes, but kind of a really good example of the free market is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression right before that in the 1920s. The 1920s is a very prosperous time for the United States. And, everything was kind of humming along, tons of jobs, tons of factories going up here in the United States. And we were doing so well that we essentially just got to the point in the late 1920s, early 1930s, that we had a surplus of everything. So when you get to that point, you just have too much product that nobody's going to buy, and that's kind of what led to the Great Depression. Is the country was doing so well that really nobody was buying anything. And then prices started to falter, and then we went into really bad, depression from there, which took us, many years for us to come out of. So here's a diagram of the circular flow model. Um, you know, we've got households. They've got buying power that goes to the businesses. Businesses have input payments, and then reverse. You've got input factors from the households, and that's going to the businesses for goods and services. So how prices are determined, a seller may want to sell shirts for $50, but only a few people may buy them at that price. If the seller lowers the price, quantity demanded increases. So really good example is this. I don't know how many of you are basketball fans, but Lonzo Ball, he currently plays for the Los Angeles Lakers. His dad started his own sneaker company, and the sneakers that they were selling were, I want to say they were like $300 $400 a pair for the sneakers. So there wasn't much demand for those sneakers, just because a couple different reasons. Lonzo Ball isn't like a huge superstar like LeBron James yet, and also nobody wants to pay that much for a pair of sneakers. The one thing that they did to kind of help themselves out is they were taking pre-orders for these sneakers. So they weren't going out and they weren't making thousands of sneakers hoping that people would buy them. They were waiting for these pre-orders to come in. They knew exactly how many that they needed to make, and then at that point they had their money in hand. They were able to make the sneakers, and then they were able to deliver them from there with little waste. And that's just the difference between like a pull production and a push production. And we'll go over that later on this semester as well, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there for an example. Hmm. So like I said, covering supply and demand here. So supply, that's just the quantity of products that manufacturers or owners are willing to sell at different prices at a specific time. Demand, the quantity of products that people are willing to buy at different prices at a specific time. And then the market price, which is the equilibrium point, the price determined by supply and demand. We'll have a couple charts here in the next coming up. So here we have the supply curve. So as you can see down here at the bottom, you've got the price starting at $5 with the quantity of t-shirts at $5. So, as price goes up, the quantity goes up. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the demand curve where, as price goes down, the quantity goes down as well. So it's all about finding that equilibrium point whenever you're looking at the supply and demand curve, and figuring out, where's kind of that sweet spot. So it kind of figures out, at the quantity of 25 shirts, the price being at $15, that kind of, makes a good point as where if you go, over 25 shirts, then the t-shirts start to get a little more expensive. Consumers probably aren't going to want them as much. So yeah, it's just all about finding that equilibrium point. So competition within free markets, perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. I always struggle with that word. And then we do have monopoly. So monopoly, not necessarily talking about the game. We're talking about one company that kind of runs everything. Monopolies were a really big thing, I would say, in the early 1900s, especially with like railroads. The issue run into with monopolies are price fixing. And if there's only one or two companies that are working together for something, then they can talk to each other and let say we're going to charge so much for a product or so much for a service, and then that doesn't benefit the consumer in the long run. And then that's why Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, and tried to break up monopolies as much as possible. Been a lot of talk about monopolies lately, just because we do have a lot of big banks that are kind of doing the same thing right now. A lot of the tech companies, so. It's a hot topic among politicians to say we need to break up the banks, we need to break up the tech companies. The only problem with that is we're in a free market, so it kind of contradicts one another. Where if we are in a free market, we want them to kind of do whatever they want, but at the same time, how much government input do we need from that? So benefits and limitations of free markets. So for benefits, it allows for open competition among companies, and it provides opportunities for poor people to work their way out of poverty. Um, as far as competition goes, if somebody is selling something cheaper than you are, more than likely people are going to start buying from them. And then it's just going to be a battle between the companies on who has the cheapest product. But then also quality plays a role in that as well. So I mean, you want to have a good combination of a quality product at an affordable price. Some limitations: people may start to let greed drive them, which I mean we've seen time and time again. We'll take a look at the recession from 2008 later on in the semester, but That's a really good example of kind of what happened there is, banks were giving out mortgages to pretty much everybody. They had kind of met their limits with who they could give mortgages to, so they were taking on riskier borrowers who probably didn't deserve to get mortgages. And the problem with that is um, some of these Wall Street banks were buying up these mortgage-backed securities, and when the borrowers who shouldn't have got the loans to begin with were defaulting on these loans, then the banks weren't getting paid. The banks weren't getting paid. They're starting to fail, and then at that point, somebody has to step in and kind of bail them out, which is exactly what happened. So there was a lot of talk about, should we just let the banks fail just because they made really bad loans? And it just got to the point where they were just too big to fail. And the big kind of player in this was AIG, which AIG had bought a bunch of securities that were mortgage backed. And AIG actually controls most of the retirement plans in the United States. So if AIG had fell, then most of the retirement plans in the United States would have fallen, and that would have been no good for anybody, just because so many people had worked their entire lives for their retirement plans, and if nothing is there, then they would have pretty much worked until the day they died. So I'm not big into government kind of input in those situations, but like I said, it was a situation where they were too big to fail, and the government kind of had to step in, or else the citizens here in the United States would have been in a really bad spot. So just kind of some strange taxes in the United States. So here in Illinois, there's a 5% candy tax unless flour is an ingredient in the treat. New Mexico citizens that reach 100 years old are exempt from state taxes. I mean, that's kind of a nice payoff if you're 100 years old or older. In Minnesota, there is a marijuana tax of $3.50 per gram. And then in New York, if you change your bagel by slicing it or adding cream cheese, an 8% or 8-cent tax is put on your bill. So this is just kind of some examples of government stepping in and imposing different laws, you know, on the free market and the free economy. So socialism. Um, Socialism is an economic system based on the premise that some, if not most, basic businesses should be owned by the government so that the profits can be more evenly distributed among the people. Entrepreneurs run smaller businesses, citizens are highly taxed, government is more involved in protecting the environment and the poor. Um, Socialism is one of those kind of hot topic words that is always thrown out there amongst politicians, where especially when we start talking about like universal health care and that sort of thing. Uh, a lot of politicians don't want universal health care just because they want it to be up to the free market, let the hospitals kind of do whatever they want. Some politicians do want kind of a socialistic kind of view where we have universal health care and it's run by the government. Um, I see pros and cons of both. And yeah, I'm just gonna let the kind of politicians sort that out, and then I'll just kind of follow what they say. So there is kind of an uptick with socialistic countries right now. So socialism has been more successful in some countries than others. This photo shows Denmark's clean and modern public transportation system. In Greece, overspending caused a debt crisis. What other factors might lead to slower growth in socialistic countries? So I think socialism can work if kind of everybody's on the same page and you do have a strong government presence. Denmark, I'm trying to think, Switzerland, some of those European countries over there do have more socialistic kind of views, and they've made it work. They've done really well with it. But like in Greece, if you don't have a strong government who's just willing to spin, 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 then it doesn't necessarily work. So, you just kind of have to take, the good with the bad on it. So, some benefits of socialism: social equality, free education, free healthcare, free childcare, longer vacations, shorter work weeks, and generous sick leave. Um, you know, if kind of everybody is in this together and a lot of it is government controlled, then we don't necessarily have the need for a free market and companies working around the clock to provide a lot of this stuff for us. So, you know, they are able to kind of offer some of these things over here. So free education, free healthcare. Those are two really big topics right now, especially going through the United States government on should we have it, should we not have it, and just going towards more of that benefit of socialism, and if we're able to afford it here in the United States. So the negative consequences of socialism: few incentives for business people to take risks, just because the government is always going to be there to bail them out. Um, Brain drain, which is the loss of the best and brightest people to other countries. So people who are really bright might go to a free market economy, just because they can earn more there. They don't have to rely on the government to help them out, and they can just kind of do what they want. They can be their own boss. And then fewer inventions and less innovation because the reward is not as great as capitalistic countries, kind of like what I was talking about there. So communism, also another really hot topic when it comes to politics. Communism is an economic and political system in which the government makes almost all economic decisions and owns almost all the major factors of production. So prices don't reflect demand, which may lead to shortages of items, including food and clothing. Most communist countries today suffer severe economic depression. So just off the top of my head, some of the communist countries out there: North Korea, Cuba. Cuba's starting to come around a little bit more, but for years and years and years, Fidel Castro was the dictator down there, and he was running a communist regime. So, um, in theory, communism or Marxism, it might work on paper, but I think when you start to implement it, greed just becomes too big of a factor, and you get one or two people at the top who just want all the power and all the greed, and that's why it just hasn't worked. So two major economic systems. So we have free market economies, economic systems in which the market largely determines what goods and services can get produced, who gets them, and how the economy grows. And then we have command economies, which is economic systems in which the government largely decides what goods and services will be produced, who will get them, and how the economy will grow. Neither free market nor command economies have created sound economic conditions, so communist governments are disappearing. Socialist governments are cutting back on social programs, lowering taxes, and moving towards capitalism. And then capitalist countries are increasing social programs and moving more towards socialism. So, it's kind of a yin and a yang situation where you kind of have to, have a little bit of both to make it work. So, going back to the example here in the United States, where we do have seems like the Democratic Party wants a little more socialism to be here in the United States, whereas the Republican Party is all about capitalism. So I do think you need that balance between the two to kind of argue both sides of it, and then we can kind of get the best product out of the two. So mixed economies, economic systems in which some allocation of resources is made by the market and some by the government. Gross domestic product. So that's something you probably hear quite a bit through the news, or just shortened up as GDP. So that's the total value of final goods and services and produced in a country in a given year. As long as a company is within a country's border, their numbers go into the country's GDP, even if they are foreign owned. So an example of that would be like Toyota. Even though Toyota is I think it's a Japanese company, um, they still produce cars over here in the United States, so it still goes into the United States GDP. And when the GDP changes, businesses feel the effect. And then we've got gross output here, a measure of total sales volume at all stages of production. So the United States GDP here, as you can see throughout the years, our GDP has gone up, quite a bit, just because we do have so much happening here in the United States, as far as kind of what we're producing. And when you look around the landscape, I mean, we're producing a lot here in the United States, even though, the politicians like to say that, China is kind of outdoing us right now. I mean, that's not necessarily the case at all. I think, our gross domestic product here in the United States is an all-time high. And whenever you look at the other countries, we're still beating, China by quite a bit. So, key economic indicators, unemployment rate is always, a really good topic with politicians, and that's just the number of civilians at least 16 years old who are unemployed and try to find a job within the prior 4 weeks. There's four types of unemployment. We have frictional, structural, cyclical, and seasonal. Um, Out of those, seasonal is probably going to be the one that you kind of hear about the most, and a lot of that is like, if you have somebody who's doing landscaping throughout, the spring, summer, and into fall, they're going to be employed. But when you get into the winter time, they're not going to be working too much, and then that way they're going to go and file for unemployment, throughout that time. So unemployment rate is kind of a difficult topic just because, somebody might say, we have a really low unemployment rate, and what does that really mean? Does that mean everybody's employed full time? Does that mean everybody's working part time? That sort of thing. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that the politicians probably give us the true reflection of a real unemployment rate here in the United States. Just because when I think of unemployment, I think of individuals who aren't working full time. But I know in those numbers they're counting individuals who are working part time on it. Some other economic indicators, we've got inflation, a general rise in the prices of goods and services over time. Um, in the United States, typically has a 2% inflation rate. So when you think about, something that was maybe $10 in 1990, how much is that going to cost in today? So based on 2%, you're probably looking in the upwards range of close to $20, that sort of thing. So there's different inflation calculators out there, and you just have to take that into consideration that especially salaries. When somebody talks about like, oh, it was the 1950s and I got $3,000 salary, go to an inflation calculator and see kind of what that comes up in today's terms. So I do that quite a bit where I'm constantly going back and forth to see kind of how much inflation has gone throughout the years. So disinflation, a situation in which price increases are um, slowing. The inflation rate is declining. We have deflation, a situation in which prices are declining, and then stagflation, a situation when the economy is slowing but prices are going up anyhow. Couple other things here. We've got inflation price indexes, so consumer price index or CPI, monthly statistics that measure the pace of inflation or deflation, core inflation, CPI minus food and energy costs, and then we have producer price index, which is an index that measures the change in prices at the wholesale level. So productivity in the United States, productivity in the U.S. has risen due to technological advances that have made production faster and easier, which high productivity through computers and robots can lead to high unemployment. So that's something that we're constantly battling with here in the United States is with so much automation, especially like in the automobile sector, where these assembly lines and these factory workers are kind of kind of getting pushed out just because of robotics and how we're able to do so much with either robots or technology on it. And I mean, it's not just something that's happening in the automobile sector; it's happening pretty much in every sector. So even like in my job, I do a lot of underwriting on loans and the days of going in and talking to a banker and having them put on an application for you and making the decision right there kind of based on their own professional viewpoint, those days are going to be long gone here shortly, just because with artificial intelligence, we have different systems that are making the decisions for us now for loans. So it used to be when I started in working for our credit department, and I was originating probably close to $20 million in loans each year. And now, when I talk to people that are currently working in my old position, they're generating about half of that in loan originations. Just because so much of it is automated now, where people are just going online, they're filling out an application, and the computers are kind of making the decision for you. And I mean, doesn't matter what financial institution you go to, pretty much everybody's kind of going that way. Um, I know I got a Chase credit card not that long ago, and I went online, I applied for the credit card, and then it gave me a decision within, I think it was 3 or 4 minutes, which something at SEFCU we're kind of striving to get to there and get to that point, but we obviously don't have the resources that Chase has. So productivity in the service sector. So new technology adds the quality of services provided, but not to the worker's output. A new form of measurement needs to be created to account for the quality as well as the quantity of output. So new technology can improve the quality of services without necessarily increasing the number of people served. A doctor can make more accurate diagnosis with scans, for instance, but can still only see so many patients in a day. How can productivity measures capture improvements in the quality of service? Kind of going back to that, what I was talking about just a couple of minutes ago with AI or artificial intelligence, where, if computers can kind of help make some of these decisions for us, then that's going to help us out in the long run. The problem is, like a doctor, I mean, they're so skilled and they go through so many years of training that how can you kind of get that general sense put into a computer? And that's kind of what they're struggling with right now with AI. We're even seeing it just on something like, automated driving, or in some of these cars that are, driverless cars. Um, just being able to drive in tough conditions, like with snowy weather, whether it's raining, different things like that. Um, you know, as human beings, we've just kind of been exposed to that in our entire lives, so we kind of know what to do in those situations. Some of us are obviously better than others, driving in the snow, but then teaching a robot how to do that or teaching a computer how to do that, that can be a really difficult thing just because they haven't been exposed to it, their entire lives, kind of like what we have. So, business cycles, these are periodic rises and falls that occur in economies over time. 4 phases of long-term business cycles. So you have an economic boom, then you have a recession, which are 2 or more consecutive quarters of decline in the GDP. You have a depression, which is a severe recession, usually accompanied by deflation. And then after that, you have a recovery. So, what I was talking about a little bit ago, as far as the Great Depression here in the United States, we had the economic boom of the 1920s. Things started to go downhill just because we had a surplus of everything. There was no demand for anything, so we stopped supplying so much, went into a recession, then we went into the Great Depression, and then after that we have, the recovery when the economy stabilizes and starts to grow again, eventually leading to an economic boom. It took a long time for the United States to recover after the Great Depression, and it wasn't until, late 1930s, early 1940s when we entered into World War II when we started to see recovery. Um, as far as economy goes, they always say, wartime is, great for business. And here in the United States, we definitely saw it just because, so many like the factories that were, shut off because of the Great Depression were up and running again, making wartime supplies. Whether it's making automobiles for the war, different, guns, bombs, anything like that. I know, like my grandfather, he was in World War II over in, Europe fighting, and then my grandma, she was here in the United States, and she worked at a bomb factory. So that was kind of a running joke between her family that my grandma was making bombs and sending them over to my grandfather. So we have fiscal policy, the federal government's efforts to keep the economy stable by increasing or decreasing taxes or government spending. Fiscal policy, that's something that we hear pretty much every day in the news about our politicians. Tools of fiscal policy, taxation, and government spending. Like I said, we hear it every day in the news. A couple other things that we always hear in the news, national deficit, which is the amount of money the federal government spends beyond what it collects in taxes for a given fiscal year. We have national debt, which is the sum of the government's deficits over time, and then national surplus, when the government takes in more revenue than it spends, which I couldn't tell you the last time we had a national surplus. So the national debt has reached over 20 trillion, $20 trillion here in the United States. Um, If $1 bills were stacked, the national debt would stretch over 1,350,000 miles. The moon is only 238 and 857 miles away. So, as you can see, we have a lot of debt here in the United States. So, whenever we're talking about money, we're always talking about, how much really is $1 million, $1 billion, $1 trillion. So, here's a really good representation of that. So, $1 million can buy an egg McMuffin and a large coffee for President Trump and 2,000 Secret Service members every day for almost 4 months. So when we look at, $1 billion can buy egg McMuffins and large coffees for them for 308 years. And then $1 trillion can buy egg McMuffins and large coffees for them for 307, 681 years, which is just a stupid amount of money. I don't know how many of you know who Neil deGrasse Tyson is. He is the individual that is responsible for Pluto no longer being a planet. He's a very famous scientist, but a few years ago he had a really good example of how rich Bill Gates is. So Bill Gates, I think his net worth right now is I forget how many billion he is worth right now, but I'll look it up on my phone really quick as I'm kind of talking here. So Bill Gates, they were talking about whenever we're walking down the street, like what does it take for you to bend over and pick up some loose change? So if it's a penny, if it's a nickel, you're probably not going to be bending over for that just because it's not all that much. But if it's maybe like a quarter, you're probably going to bend over for that because a quarter we can use that for parking meters, different thing like that. So for Bill Gates to bend over, and I just looked it up, he is worth $100 billion right now. So for Bill Gates to kind of bend over, what would equal a quarter to Bill Gates? And Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of did the math on that. It ended up being like $50,000. So whenever you're thinking about how rich Bill Gates is, I mean, a quarter to Bill Gates is pretty much $50,000, which is just a stupid amount of money. So that kind of puts it into perspective as to how rich Bill Gates really is. So monetary policy, the management of the money supply and interest rates by the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed's most visible role is raising and lowering interest rates. This is something I deal with on a daily basis working for CEFCU. So when the economy is booming, the Feds tend to raise interest rates, which is kind of what we're seeing right now, where rates are slowly creeping up. And then when the economy is in a recession, the Feds tend to decrease interest rates. So just like on automobile loans, when I first started from CEFCU, we were kind of coming out of the recession. Interest rates were at an all-time low, so we were charging a 1.99% interest on automobiles for 5 years, and now we're up to 3.64. So we've gone up. Almost a full 2 percentage points, over the last, 5 to 6 years on those loans, just because we have seen, a rebound in the economy. We're doing quite well right now. So the Fed is slowly raising the interest rates, which, we have to reflect, on our business. All right, so that's all I have for chapter 2, and we will see you next time with chapter 3.